400 versus 40, 0-0. How the Spartans held the Persian Empire for 3 days. In 480 BCE, the most powerful empire of its age reached a narrow passage between the mountains and the sea. King Xerxes had brought Persian power into Greece with an enormous invasion force. His objective was not simply to defeat an army. He intended to break organized Greek resistance and open the road south. Standing in his way was King Leonidas. The popular legend remembers 300 Spartans facing an endless Persian army, but the reality was more complex. Several thousand Greek troops initially defended Thermopylae, with the Spartans forming the famous elite contingent at the center of the story. Even so, the imbalance was staggering. On open ground, Persian numbers could have surrounded and overwhelmed a much smaller force. Leonidas therefore chose a battlefield where numbers would become difficult to use. Thermopylae was the weapon. The ancient coastline approached much closer to the mountains than it does today, creating a restricted corridor. Xerxes could bring tens of thousands of soldiers to the region, but he could not send all of them against the Greeks simultaneously. When the Persian attacks began, the battlefield compressed imperial power into a narrow front. Greek hoplites locked shields and presented their spears toward the advancing formations. The Persians had reserves, archers, cavalry, and troops drawn from across their vast empire, but the terrain prevented many of those advantages from being fully exploited. The road remained closed. Another attack came. Still the Greeks held. What should have been a temporary obstacle was becoming an imperial embarrassment. Every hour mattered. Leonidas did not need to destroy Xerxes' army. He needed to delay it while the wider Greek resistance prepared farther south. For 2 days, that strategy worked, and that success created the most dangerous illusion of the battle. The Greeks could begin believing Thermopylae was nearly impossible to break. But Leonidas's position contained a weakness. Somewhere above the famous battlefield, a mountain route could bypass the narrow corridor entirely. If Xerxes discovered it, the terrain protecting the Greeks would become the terrain trapping them. For now, Leonidas still controlled the road. But the Persian Empire had not reached Thermopylae through numbers alone. Behind the soldiers stood an extraordinary system of ships, supplies, engineers, animals, roads, and communications stretching across enormous distances. To understand why Xerxes could keep attacking until another solution appeared, we have to understand the machine he brought to Greece. Xerxes' war machine at the edge of Europe. Long before the Persians reached Thermopylae, Xerxes had already overcome an enemy capable of destroying his invasion without fighting a single battle. Distance. Moving a massive army across the ancient world required far more than soldiers. Men needed food and water. Horses required fodder. Weapons and equipment had to move with the columns. Messages had to travel between commanders, while ships supported operations along the coastline. Xerxes was not simply marching an army toward Greece. He was mobilizing an empire. Persian territory stretched across an enormous area, allowing the king to draw troops and resources from many different peoples. Infantry, cavalry, archers, engineers, sailors, animals, and support personnel became parts of a military system prepared years before the invasion. One of the greatest obstacles was the Hellespont, separating Asia from Europe. Persian engineers constructed pontoon bridges across the water, allowing troops and equipment to cross into European territory. Farther south, another extraordinary engineering project demonstrated the scale of Persian preparation. A canal had been cut through the Athos Peninsula, reducing the danger to ships sailing around a coastline where an earlier Persian fleet had suffered catastrophic losses. The fleet was essential. Phoenician, Egyptian, Cypriot, and other naval contingents helped support an invasion whose land forces consumed enormous quantities of resources every day. And this revealed the weakness hidden inside Persian strength. The larger Xerxes' army became, the more difficult it was to sustain. Thousands of soldiers needed water simultaneously. Animals consumed additional supplies. Roads became crowded. Camps required space. Communication became harder as forces stretched across great distances. Persia had created a military weapon of extraordinary scale, but that weapon had to keep moving. Then it reached Thermopylae. Suddenly, an empire capable of crossing continents confronted a passage where only a fraction of its strength could fight effectively. But Xerxes possessed something Leonidas could not ignore: time, reserves, and the ability to search for alternatives. And Thermopylae was not the only battlefield determining whether Persia could advance. While Greek spears blocked the road, warships were fighting in the waters near Artemisium. If the Greek fleet failed there, holding Thermopylae might no longer matter. The battle for the pass was only half of the plan. The war being fought beyond Thermopylae. While Leonidas blocked the Persian army on land, another battle was unfolding beyond the coastline. Near Artemisium, Greek warships confronted the Persian fleet. The two battlefields were part of the same defensive strategy. Thermopylae controlled the land route south. Artemisium guarded the nearby sea lanes. If either position collapsed, the other could become dangerously exposed. Xerxes needed to open both. The Persian fleet reflected the enormous reach of his empire. Experienced crews came from maritime regions, including Phoenicia, Egypt, Cyprus, and Greek territories under Persian control. Against them stood a smaller Greek fleet in which Athens provided a major contingent of triremes. These vessels were built for aggressive maneuvering. Powered by coordinated rows of oarsmen, a trireme could accelerate toward an enemy and use the bronze ram at its bow to strike the opposing hull. But the Greeks faced the same problem at sea that Leonidas faced on land: numbers. Their answer was also similar: use geography. Confined waters could make it harder for Persia to deploy its larger fleet effectively. Before and during the operations around Artemisium, severe storms also damaged Persian naval forces, destroying ships without Greek intervention. Still, the Persian fleet remained dangerous. Greek commanders could not afford to sacrifice their naval strength merely to defend northern waters. Their objective was to contest Persian movement while preserving enough ships for the battles that might follow. That made Thermopylae and Artemisium dependent on each other. If Persian forces broke through Leonidas, the fleet could be threatened from the land and would lose much of the strategic reason for remaining in the north. If the fleet were destroyed first, Persian naval freedom could undermine the position at Thermopylae. So two clocks were running simultaneously. Leonidas did not know exactly how long the fleet could remain. The sailors at Artemisium could not know how long the pass would hold. Each force was buying time for the other. This is why Thermopylae cannot be understood as an isolated last stand. It was one part of a larger attempt to control where Xerxes could move and where Persian numbers could be brought to bear. Yet the success of the land defense depended on something beyond geography. The men inside the pass had to maintain formation while repeated attacks tried to tear it apart. That was where the Spartan system became crucial. Their greatest weapon was not individual strength. It was the ability to remain organized when everything around them descended into chaos. Inside the Spartan way of war, the Spartan advantage at Thermopylae was not that every warrior was an unstoppable killing machine. It was that they had been trained not to become individuals when the battle descended into chaos. Ancient close combat could unravel quickly. One frightened soldier stepped backward. Another followed. A gap appeared between shields. The enemy pushed into it, and within moments, an organized formation could become a crowd trying to escape. Sparta built its military system around preventing that collapse. From youth, Spartan male citizens underwent the agogé, an education and training system emphasizing endurance, obedience, competition, and collective discipline. On the battlefield, those qualities became more important than spectacular individual skill. A hoplite fought as part of a formation. His large shield protected not only himself, but contributed to the security of those around him. Spears extended toward the enemy, while warriors maintained tight spacing. Every man depended on others holding their positions. At Thermopylae, this style of warfare matched the terrain almost perfectly. Persian troops advancing through restricted ground encountered an organized front that was difficult to surround. Leonidas could also rotate Greek contingents, allowing exhausted units periods of recovery while fresh troops took their place. Herodotus even describes the Spartans using controlled withdrawals before suddenly turning against pursuing Persians. Such maneuvers were dangerous because a false retreat could easily become a real one if discipline disappeared. For the Spartans, control itself became a weapon. But they were not fighting alone. Other Greek hoplites also understood formation warfare, and the resistance of Thermopylae depended on thousands of allied soldiers during its initial stages. The later legend would concentrate attention on Leonidas and his Spartans, obscuring many of the men who shared the danger. Nor were the Spartans invincible. Training could maintain formation, but it could not eliminate exhaustion, casualties, or encirclement. That limitation was about to become decisive. The Greek formation was extraordinarily difficult to break from the direction it had been designed to face. But Thermopylae had another entrance. High in the mountains was a route capable of reaching the Greek rear. Leonidas knew such paths represented a danger and had troops guarding the high ground. His defense therefore depended on one condition that no amount of Spartan discipline could replace. The Persians could never be allowed to get behind him, and soon someone would show Xerxes exactly how to do it. The hidden weakness inside Leonidas' perfect position. From the front, Thermopylae seemed designed to stop an empire. The mountains restricted movement on one side. The ancient shoreline pressed close on the other. Between them, Leonidas could concentrate his defenders across ground too narrow for Xerxes to deploy his full strength. But the position was never truly sealed. Above the battlefield ran a mountain route known as the Anapeia Path. If Persian troops crossed it, they could descend behind the Greeks and transform Leonidas's defensive sanctuary into a trap. The danger was understood. Phocian troops had been assigned to guard the route, revealing that the Greeks knew their survival depended on more than holding the famous pass below. For 2 days, however, the main Persian attacks kept attention focused on the front. Then Xerxes received the information he needed. According to Herodotus, a local Greek named Ephialtes revealed the mountain route to the Persians in expectation of a reward. His name would eventually become synonymous with betrayal, but his importance was military rather than symbolic. He gave Xerxes another battlefield. The Persian king no longer needed to solve Thermopylae by repeatedly attacking its strongest point. A force under Hydarnes could move through the mountains and attack the defense from behind. The operation began under cover of darkness. Persian troops climbed away from the main battlefield, following a route where unfamiliar terrain, confusion, or organized resistance could still stop them. Eventually, they encountered the Phocians guarding the high ground. The Phocians prepared for battle, but Hydarnes had no reason to waste precious time destroying them. His objective lay farther ahead. The Persians bypassed the defenders and continued toward the rear of Thermopylae. At that moment, Leonidas had not been defeated in direct combat. His formation still controlled the pass. Yet strategically, everything had changed. The mountains that had protected his flank were now concealing the force coming to surround him. Soon the warning reached the Greek command. Persian troops were approaching from behind. The position could no longer function as intended. But before the final decision came, the defenders faced another enemy that had been weakening them since the first attack: their own bodies. Days of heat, wounds, limited rest, heavy equipment, thirst, and repeated combat were accumulating. Thermopylae was becoming a battle of endurance, and the exhausted men holding it were about to learn that their next fight might also be their last. The battle of exhaustion. No one could see. By the third day, the defenders at Thermopylae were fighting more than Persians. They were fighting exhaustion. Ancient combat demanded enormous physical effort. Shields had to remain raised. Spears had to be controlled inside crowded formations. Protective equipment trapped heat while soldiers pushed, struck, withdrew, and returned to position. Then came the waiting. A Persian attack might last minutes, but the uncertainty surrounding the next assault could continue for hours. Men could rest, but never completely. Every movement across the enemy lines might signal another advance. Sleep became limited, muscles weakened. Thirst returned constantly. The battlefield itself deteriorated. Broken weapons and damaged equipment accumulated around the fighting ground. Wounded men required attention. Bodies occupied spaces where soldiers still needed to maneuver. Every new engagement took place across terrain increasingly shaped by the previous one. The Greeks attempted to manage this pressure by rotating contingents through the fighting. While some defended the front, others could recover. But rotation could only slow exhaustion. It could not reverse it. Every Greek casualty represented a permanent reduction in a limited force. Xerxes, by contrast, could continue sending fresh formations forward. This created a brutal equation. Persia did not necessarily need to destroy Leonidas in a single attack. Continued pressure could gradually weaken the defenders until discipline and physical endurance began to fail. The Persians suffered too. Their soldiers had to advance toward a position where previous attacks had already failed. They saw casualties ahead and knew the Greek formation remained intact. Thermopylae was therefore wearing down both armies differently. Persia was spending men. Leonidas was running out of them. Still, the Greeks had one powerful psychological advantage. They had survived. Each failed Persian assault reinforced the belief that the pass could continue holding. Then the warning from the mountains destroyed that confidence. Hydarnes was approaching from behind. Now every physical weakness became more dangerous. Wounded soldiers might have to move. Exhausted troops might need to withdraw quickly. Commanders had to reorganize forces before the encirclement closed. The Greeks had spent days preparing for attacks from one direction. Suddenly, the enemy could come from two. And while the exhausted defenders absorbed what that meant, Persian soldiers were still moving through the darkness above them. The loud battle at Thermopylae had failed to break Leonidas. The quiet march through the mountains was about to do it. The night the mountains changed sides. While the main armies remained separated at Thermopylae, Hydarnes and his Persian troops were moving through the mountains. They did not need to defeat Leonidas from the front. They only needed to reach the road behind him. The night march was dangerous. The Persians had to maintain direction through unfamiliar terrain, preserve organization in darkness, and move quickly enough to complete the encirclement before the Greeks could escape. Every hour mattered. The mountain route was guarded by Phocian troops, but their encounter with Hydarnes did not become the decisive battle Leonidas needed. According to Herodotus, the sound of Persian movement through fallen leaves alerted the Phocians. Surprised by the approaching force, they moved toward higher ground and prepared to defend themselves. Hydarnes refused to become distracted. He did not need to destroy them. He needed to pass them. Persian archers kept pressure on the Phocians while the main force continued toward the rear of Thermopylae. That decision changed everything. Below, the Greek defensive line remained intact. Xerxes had still not forced his way through the main position. But the battle was already being lost somewhere the Spartans could not see. Thermopylae had protected Leonidas because the terrain forced Persian attacks into a restricted corridor. Once Hydarnes reached the opposite side, the same geography would restrict Greek movement and help close the trap. Terrain had no loyalty. For 2 days it had served Leonidas. Now Xerxes was turning it against him. Warnings eventually reached the Greek command that Persian troops were approaching from behind. The tactical question that had dominated the battle disappeared. Leonidas no longer needed to ask how to stop another frontal assault. He needed to decide who could still escape. Much of the Greek force could withdraw before the encirclement became complete. But someone would need to remain close enough to the Persians to prevent that withdrawal from becoming a pursuit and slaughter. That meant the final decision at Thermopylae was not simply about dying with honor. It had a military purpose. As dawn approached, the Persian force continued descending from the mountains. Ahead of Leonidas stood Xerxes. Behind him came Hydarnes, and between those two armies remained a brief window in which hundreds of men had to decide what they would do with the last hours available to them. The battle was about to become a last stand. But first came the moment history often rushes past, the moment when the defenders knew they were going to lose, while there was still enough time for some of them to leave. The hours between knowing and dying. Leonidas now knew the trap was closing. Persian troops remained in front of Thermopylae. Hydarnes was approaching from behind. The defensive position that had resisted Xerxes for days could no longer perform its original purpose. But the encirclement was not yet complete. There was still time to leave. Much of the Greek force withdrew, preserving soldiers who would be needed as the war continued. Leonidas remained with his Spartans. Hundreds of Thespians under Demophilus also stayed, while Theban troops remained under circumstances that ancient accounts describe differently. This is where the famous story becomes more complicated than the legend of the 300. The men who stayed did not necessarily remain for one identical reason. For Leonidas, there was a clear military purpose. Someone had to cover the withdrawal and continue delaying Xerxes. A retreating force exposed to immediate pursuit could be destroyed before reaching safety. There was also Spartan military culture and, according to Herodotus, a Delphic prophecy suggesting that Sparta would either be destroyed or lose one of its kings. Whether Leonidas believed he was fulfilling that prophecy cannot be known. What can be known is that he chose to remain when survival was still possible for others. The Thespians make that decision even more remarkable. They were not Spartans. They had not been shaped by the same institutions or obligations. Yet they stayed beside Leonidas and would suffer devastating losses during the final resistance. As the other Greeks moved south, those remaining prepared for a completely different kind of battle. There was no longer a fourth day to preserve strength for, no reason to conserve weapons for another defensive cycle, no realistic expectation that the position could be recovered. The objective had become brutally simple. Keep the Persians occupied for as long as possible. Imagine those final preparations without the mythology that later surrounded them. Men checking damaged equipment, wounded soldiers determining whether they could still fight, companions realizing that the road being used by departing Greeks was probably a road they would never take themselves. They did not know they were becoming legends. They knew only that two Persian forces were closing around them. When the final combat began, the remaining Greeks reportedly moved farther forward than before, abandoning some of the caution that had defined the earlier defense. Leonidas would soon fall. His men would fight around his body, spears would break, and the battle would collapse into increasingly desperate close combat. By the end, Xerxes would possess Thermopylae. But what happened immediately after the Persian victory reveals that these 3 days had left a mark even on the empire that won them, because Xerxes did not simply continue south and forget Leonidas. The dead Spartan king would become part of the message Persia intended to send to everyone still considering resistance. What Xerxes did after the Spartans were dead. When the resistance at Thermopylae was finally crushed, Xerxes had what he needed. The road south was open. Leonidas was dead. The remaining defenders had been overwhelmed, and the northern Greek defensive position had collapsed. Militarily, Persia had won the battle, but victory had come after days of resistance. According to Herodotus, Xerxes ordered Leonidas's body to be decapitated and subjected to further mutilation. The account comes from a Greek historian and should be treated cautiously, but the episode became part of how antiquity remembered the Persian king's reaction to the Spartan resistance. Yet destroying Leonidas did not destroy the war. The Greek fleet withdrew from Artemisium once Thermopylae could no longer be defended. Persian forces advanced into central Greece, and Athens now stood exposed. Its population faced an extraordinary decision: abandon the city. Most Athenians were evacuated while their fleet remained operational. When Persian forces reached Athens, they captured the city and burned major structures on the Acropolis. At that moment, Xerxes appeared close to achieving a spectacular victory. Thermopylae had fallen. Athens had been occupied. Persian forces had penetrated deep into Greece. But the Athenians had preserved the weapon that mattered most: their ships. The Greek fleet regrouped near Salamis, where Themistocles recognized another opportunity to use confined geography against Persian numbers. This time, the battlefield would be water. Persian ships entered the narrow waters around Salamis, expecting to crush Greek naval resistance. Instead, congestion made their numerical superiority harder to exploit. Greek triremes attacked. Persian formations became disrupted. The fleet suffered a major defeat. Xerxes still possessed a powerful army, but the strategic situation had changed. He eventually returned to Asia with part of his forces, leaving Mardonius to continue the campaign. The following year, Greek forces confronted Mardonius at Plataea. There, the Persian invasion army suffered the defeat that effectively ended the attempt to conquer mainland Greece. Thermopylae had therefore not stopped Xerxes. It had delayed him, and that distinction matters. The battle was one part of a wider resistance in which the Greeks repeatedly attempted to fight Persian power under conditions that reduced its advantages. Xerxes left Thermopylae possessing the battlefield, but the Greeks carried away something he could not control: the story. Over centuries, thousands of original defenders would fade behind the famous Spartans. Complex strategy would become a simple last stand. Leonidas would become larger than the king who defeated him. Persia won the pass, yet history would make Thermopylae famous for the men who failed to hold it. And that is the final contradiction we need to understand: the defeat that outlived the empire. Thermopylae ended exactly as Xerxes needed it to end. The Persians controlled the pass. Leonidas was dead. The surviving invasion force could continue south. Yet more than 500 years later, Thermopylae is remembered primarily through the men who lost. That is the battle's greatest paradox. Military victory and historical immortality are not the same thing. After the Persian invasion ultimately failed, Thermopylae could be remembered as part of a larger Greek resistance rather than simply a disastrous defeat. The men who died there became symbols of what later generations wanted the battle to represent: discipline, sacrifice, loyalty, and resistance against overwhelming power. But memory simplified what history had made complicated. Several thousand Greeks initially defended the pass, not only the famous Spartans. Thespians shared the final resistance. The circumstances of the Thebans remain disputed. Persian strength was enormous, but ancient estimates of Xerxes' army are debated by modern historians. The Persian forces themselves were not a mindless horde. They represented a sophisticated empire capable of moving troops, ships, supplies, animals, and information across extraordinary distances. Xerxes eventually defeated Leonidas because Persian commanders adapted when direct attacks failed. That may be Thermopylae's most important military lesson. Persia stopped fighting the battle Leonidas wanted. The Greeks had constructed a defensive problem that was extraordinarily difficult to solve from the front. Xerxes solved it by going around. Once Hydarnes crossed the mountains, Spartan discipline could no longer rescue the position. The battle, therefore, contains two remarkable achievements. Leonidas demonstrated how terrain and organization could temporarily neutralize overwhelming numerical superiority. Xerxes demonstrated that even the strongest defensive position becomes vulnerable when an enemy discovers a way to change the battlefield. Neither side was invincible. That is precisely why the story matters. The Persian Empire survived long after Thermopylae. Sparta also continued to influence Greek history. Eventually, both political worlds changed, declined, and disappeared. Even the landscape transformed. Sediment pushed the shoreline away from the ancient battlefield, altering the narrow geography that had once determined the movement of armies. But the story survived. A king standing in a restricted pass, an empire waiting beyond him, repeated attacks that failed to break the line, a hidden route through the mountains, a night march, a final decision made when escape was still possible for some, and men remaining behind while others withdrew. Thermopylae was not extraordinary because a few hundred supernatural warriors nearly destroyed the Persian Empire. They did not. It was extraordinary because human beings with ordinary physical limits managed, for 3 critical days, to make an enormous imperial advantage difficult to use. They became exhausted. They suffered wounds. Their weapons broke. Their strategy eventually failed. And they died. Persia won the battlefield. But Xerxes could not decide how future generations would remember that victory. The empire took the road. The defeated took the legend, and perhaps that is why Thermopylae still fascinates us, because history is not always remembered by those who survive it. Sometimes it belongs to those who stand in the path of something far greater than themselves, knowing they cannot